Good evening, and thank you all for being here. It's my pleasure to see so many people in this room here tonight, especially on a Friday. I can say that this panel and this lecture will certainly be worth your time, and it's an absolute treat to have both professors here. For those of you who have not yet met, my name is Zach, and I'm the president of the Thomistic Institute at UT Austin, which is putting on this event co-sponsored with the Austin Institute. The Thomistic Institute is an institute of the Pontifical Faculty of the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C., which seeks to promote the Christian intellectual tradition on college campuses through the thought of Thomas Aquinas. At our chapter, we do this through reading groups, lectures, and special events, such as this one. Speaking of our reading groups, this semester, our chapter has had the absolute privilege of reading through Dr. Buczynszewski's What We Can't Not Know with the professor himself, and it is my honor to get to introduce him now. Dr. Jay Buczynszewski is professor of government and philosophy here at UT, where he also teaches courses in the law school and the religious studies department, and where he's taught for over 40 years. He is a pillar of the Christian intellectual tradition and Christian intellectual life at UT and across the nation, speaking regularly about crucial cultural issues such as abortion in the family, educating the government department of law school about classical natural law theory, and regularly lecturing with the Thomistic Institute at colleges across the country. Furthermore, Professor Buczynszewski is a regular speaker with the Austin Institute, where he has advocated for sacramental marriage and Christian sex ethics. In my process of advertising for this event, I've had many students and professors tell me that Professor Buczynszewski's books got them through college and helped them in their intellectual formation. He's the author of numerous books and commentaries, such as Written on the Heart and How to Stay Christian in College. He's had a profound impact on our students and my own life, even though we may not recognize that with everyone. We are incredibly lucky to have Professor Buczynszewski here. But on top of that, we have the privilege to host Dr. Scott Roninger. Dr. Scott Roninger is an associate professor of philosophy at Loyola Marymount University, where he directs the Lonergan Center for Catholic Faith and Culture. He received a baccalaureate and master's in sacred theology from the Angelicum in Rome. And if that is not enough qualification for you, he then earned a master's in philosophy from the University of Chicago and a licentiate in philosophy from the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome. Finally, he earned his doctorate in philosophy from the Catholic University of America. I know we have a lot of lawyers in this room, and I will say that I think Dr. Roninger might have you beat for most time in school. It's a possibility. Dr. Roninger specializes in Catholic social teaching, the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, political philosophy, and of course, natural law. Although I've never had the chance to take a class with him, I've read through his regular professor online, and I can say that he must be a fantastic professor. Reviews critique him for defending Christian ethics, fighting and advocating for objective truth, and weighing in on crucial social issues. From that information alone, I can guarantee that his students are lucky to have him. We're very grateful to the Austin Institute for the study of family and culture, which is co-sponsoring this event and generously covering costs. If you're not familiar with them, check them out. There's plenty of people you can talk to in this room. Today, quickly, just to go over the format, each of our speakers is going to give a 20 to 25-minute brief topic. They're just going to go over their topic, give a quick speech, and they're going to ask each other questions, and then we will open it up to you guys, and I'll field those questions. We've had enough introductions for the night, so please join me in warmly welcoming our two fantastic professors.
All right. There's an enormous cable behind me. So if you see me falling, I won't fall flat on my face because this thing is here. I might fall flat on my back, but you'll be ready for it and you can all laugh appropriately at the right moment as I splash down. You need to bear with me in another way too. You know, for an informal panel like this one, different organizations have different ideas about this. Some of them think that it's really not right to prepare a written talk. But I had so much to pack in the time allotted, and in fact, I originally thought that it was supposed to be 15 to 20 minutes, not 20 to 25, that I realized that if I just spoke off the cuff, I was going to go way, way over my time. And I don't believe in that. My philosophy is something like that of the old modernist architect Mies van der Rohe, who said less is more. And so I did write this all down, and I'll try not to be too dull. People often claim that the natural moral law couldn't really be a law because there aren't any penalties for violating it. I think that this is astonishingly naive. Just as there are human consequences for violating the human law, you pay a fine, you're pulled over, you get a ticket, you're sent to jail, you're sent to some other penalty. And just as there are divine consequences for violating the divine law, so there are natural consequences for violating the natural law. Now, I'd be the first to admit that not all of the natural consequences necessarily hit the wrongdoer himself. Some of them do. Sometimes they're even passed on to the next generation. The sins of the fathers are visited on the children to the third generation. And gosh, do we see that in family life. But these natural consequences nevertheless are amazingly potent. And they work in every dimension, including the physical dimension, the social dimension, and the intellectual dimension. Those who cut themselves bleed. Those who give offense to others needlessly are hated. Those who live by knives die by them. Those who indulge in heroin become its slave. Those who abandon their wives and children have no one to comfort them when they're old. Those who travel from bed to bed to bed eventually lose the very capacity for intimacy and trust, and it becomes a question whether they can ever recover it. And those who make their livings by abortion meet their victims later in their dreams. And if you think that I'm only imagining that, we have actually first-person testimony from a lot of people working in abortion mills. This is absolutely true. More generally, those who suppress their natural knowledge. There are some aspects of moral knowledge which you might innocently be, some details, some complications which you might innocently be ignorant of. But I don't think we're ever really ignorant of the moral basics. Thou shalt not kill, honor your mother and your father. And those, you can't wipe that out. You can't blot it out from the conscience. You can only suppress it. You can hold it down. You know what happens if you hold down a feisty cat, don't you? It doesn't just lie down when you hold it down. It reaches up and scratches you. Well, conscience does that too. Those who suppress their moral knowledge become stupider than they had intended. Of course, they had intended to make themselves stupid, but not that stupid. Those who refuse the one in whose image that they're made live as strangers to themselves. And those who torture their consciences are tortured in return. Now, I'm especially interested in conscience. It's not the only aspect in which these things play out. And I've written about some of the other aspects, but I'm especially interested in conscience, perhaps partly because I used to abuse my own conscience. Today, discussions of conscience are deeply confused. Maybe the greatest confusion is the idea that conscience is just a sort of a residue of socialization, that it's something pumped in from the outside as we're growing up and circulating in our milieu. You know the drill. Your parents told you things, and your teachers told you things, and your friends told you things, and the policeman told you things. And somehow all those things got inside you and made a conscience. The stuff that didn't leak out, the residue, that's your conscience. Well, that story isn't all false, but it certainly isn't all true. Certainly there is something in conscience that's influenced by teaching from outside. The ancients called it conscientia. Let's call it conscience in application, or conscience in action, or surface conscience. But there's something else in conscience that doesn't come in from outside. The ancients called it synderesis. Let's call it deep conscience. Deep conscience is the natural habit or disposition of the mind to be aware, no, not of all the details of right and wrong, but of what I call the moral basics, the most general principles, the starting points. Thomas Aquinas went so far as to say that with respect to these moral basics, the natural law, I'm quoting him, is the same for all, the same for everyone, both as to rectitude and as to knowledge. That means the same for all as to rectitude, it's right for everyone. That means the same for all as to knowledge, that at some level it's known to everyone. He explicitly states that this includes the sorts of things that we find in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments. I quote again, "For there are certain things which the natural reason of every man, of its own accord and at once, judges to be done or not to be done. For example, honor thy father and thy mother, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal." And he says, and these belong to the law of nature absolutely. Someone who says, gee, I didn't know that murder is wrong, isn't ignorant. He's in denial. He may be lying to us, or he may be lying to himself, probably both, but in one way or another, he's lying. Granted, we play tricks on our moral knowledge. We are well equipped to do that. It can be done. Since murder is deliberately taking innocent human life, I might seek to justify my murder by playing games with the meaning of those words. I might say, well, it's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life, but that bastard didn't have a life. It's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life, but he wasn't human. He was just vermin. It's wrong to deliberately take innocent human life, but he wasn't innocent. He took the job that should have gone to me. The urge to produce such excuses is sometimes taken as evidence that people don't know the natural law. I think it's evidence that they do, because the only material from which you can even construct an excuse is the natural law, distorted and abused. Even the Nazis paid a price for trying to convince themselves that slaughtering Jews wasn't wrong. A former Wehrmacht neuropsychiatrist who had treated large numbers of death camp soldiers for psychological disorders. This was, we read of this in the famous book of Robert J. Lifton, The Nazi Doctors. He said they found that the symptoms of these death camp troops were much like those of the combat troops, but worse and longer lasting. They weren't having shells raining down around their heads. They weren't being shot at. Why would their symptoms be worse? Because they were under a daily assault and bombardment, self-inflicted, on their consciences. They had the hardest time shooting women and children, especially children, and many of them had nightmares of punishment or retribution in which their victims would stand and accuse them. Allow me to point out the obvious. People with untroubled consciences don't have dreams of being accused by their victims. I don't say there can be such a thing as false conscience. I don't say that if you feel guilty, you must really be guilty of something, or that if you think something was wrong, it must have been. I'm saying the opposite, the other side of the coin. You violate one of the moral basics. It is so hard to pull the wool over your own eye that something is going to happen in conscience. Now, please don't get me wrong. Not everyone suffers remorse for wrongdoing. You might say, well, you just said that you can't do away with conscience. No, you can't do away with conscience. You can sometimes do away with remorse. There are all sorts of ways to do away with remorse. An alcoholic who was on the wagon told me once, I was in a radio interview, I'd written something about natural law. They thought this would be interesting to talk to this guy on a talk show about. And it was a call-in show. The guy said, I know exactly what you mean. He said, I'm a drunk. He said, I'm not drinking now, but I'm a drunk. He said, and back when I did drink, I felt terrible for drinking. And so I drank. You understand? The alcohol deadened the remorse so that he didn't have to feel it. And it worked. So long as he didn't repent, you notice, his remorse actually drove him into yet further wrongdoing because he felt so bad about all that drinking, he had to drink more to stop feeling bad. We tend to think of conscience as something just that holds us back. When we abuse it, it can drive us deeper in. Besides, deep conscience, what I've called deep conscience, is knowledge, not feelings. Feelings are a side effect or a symptom of the knowledge. And guilty knowledge darkly asserts itself regardless of the state of our feelings. One pro-abortion counselor complained, this was in an article by a pro-abortion journalist who had interviewed pro-abortion counselors who had counseled women who had had abortions. And one of the counselors complained, I'm not confident even now that women feel it's okay to want an abortion without feeling guilty. They say, am I some sort of monster that I feel all right about this? That statement is amazingly revealing. Plainly, if you have guilty feelings, for not having guilty feelings, you must have guilty knowledge. There is something telling you, I ought to feel bad about this. That's dreadful. What's suffering? I suggest, when I say you can do away with remorse, but you can't do away with conscience, I would suggest that conscience is allied with pursuing Furies. You know the Furies, the Erinyes of Greek mythology. They pursued the wrongdoer, sometimes painted as harpies with wings and screaming at him. In one, Orestes is going like this. It's allied with 5 pursuing Furies, but remorse is the least of them. It's the one we think of first. but it's the least of them. Even when remorse is absent, guilty knowledge generates objective needs, and I think inexorable objective needs, for confession, for atonement, for reconciliation, and for justification. I'm going to explain them. But let me just say, these other four furies are the greater sisters of remorse. Inflexible, inexorable, and relentless, and they demand satisfaction even when mere bad feelings are suppressed or fade away or never come. How this works isn't difficult to grasp. The normal outlet of remorse is to flee from wrong. The normal outlet, I say. The normal outlet of the need for confession is to admit that one has sinned. I'm guilty. I did this. It was wrong. Nobody but me did this. The normal outlet of the need for atonement is to pay the debt. We have a sense that we owe something. The normal outlet of the need for reconciliation is to restore the bonds with God and man that we have broken by our wrongdoing or injured. And the normal outlet of the need for justification. You know, the word justification is very funny. In English, and this is true in some other languages too, it has two meanings. It can mean to be aligned with justice, to be justified. It can also mean to give the appearance of being aligned with justice, to make an excuse. The normal outlet of the need for justification is to get back into justice. But if the Furies are denied their payment in the proper coin, if they're denied those normal and proper outlets, they're still going to demand a coin. They'll demand the coin that comes closest. They're still going to seek an outlet, and it may not be a pleasant outlet, driving the wrongdoer's life yet further out of kilter. Let me go through them again. As to remorse, if we refuse to repent, refuse to pay the coin, we flee not from wrong, but from thinking about it, like that fellow who phoned in and said, yeah, I felt terrible for drinking, so I drank. As to confession, we compulsively tell every sordid detail of what we've done, except that it was wrong. People have even made money out of this. The Jerry Springer show years ago, I guess that's like in prehistoric days for some of you here. He used to have people on with, guests with telling their stories. I married a horse. Well, now, why would they want to tell you about this? People think, it's because they're shameless. No, it's because they're ashamed. They want to tell you every sordid detail. They want to confess, except confess that it was wrong. As to atonement, we punish ourselves again and again and again, paying pain after pain, price after price, offering every sacrifice except the one sacrifice demanded, which is a contrite and broken heart. As to reconciliation, we simulate the restoration of broken intimacy by seeking companions who are as guilty as ourselves, even to the point of recruiting them. You could say, I've hurt these people. I'll reconcile with them. But you might instead say, I'm going to seek people who've done the kinds of hurtful things that I've done. I can get along with them. And so alcoholics will seek alcoholics, and liars will seek liars, and so forth. This is simulated reconciliation. And as to justification, we seek not to become just, but to justify ourselves. This is the revenge of conscience. The revenge of conscience. Consider just one of those, false atonement. Now, I didn't realize until just a few minutes before the talk that Dr. Roninger had given a talk about Dostoevsky yesterday, right? And he knows something about my work. I know something about his work. Some of you may have been expecting that we're going to be debating with each other, critiquing each other. Actually, I can't think of anything in what I've read of his work that I don't agree with, and I think that we're going to be complementary rather than competing here. But Dostoevsky wrote that legal punishment, he wrote this in a letter to his publisher, legal punishment inflicted for a crime intimidates a criminal infinitely less than lawmakers think. You would think, okay, we're going to deter people from committing crimes by threatening them with punishment. But he says this doesn't deter people nearly as much as you would think, partly because he himself morally demands the punishment. A part of him wants to escape the penalty, sure, but another part of him wants to be caught. He may commit his crimes carelessly, just so that he will be caught, or commit new crimes because he hasn't been caught for the old ones and can't feel that he's paid a price. This is a true story, a heartbreaking one. My wife used to be a pro-life counselor at the Austin Crisis Pregnancy Center. I think it has a different name these days. And I was speaking to one of the other counselors, and she told me this story of a woman she had counseled. This woman was not considering an abortion. That's not why she was there. She was there because she had committed abortion, and she really needed to talk. She had aborted her first child. She told her counselor to punish her husband because at that vulnerable time in her life, she's carrying their child. She found out that he had been unfaithful to her. She was mortified. She was ashamed. And she was angry. He wanted the child, so she had the abortion to punish him. That's not why she went in to talk to the counselor. She went in after she'd aborted her second child. Now, why did she do that? The counselor asked her, "Were you still angry with your husband? Was that the reason?" She said, "No, I wasn't angry with him anymore." She was angry with herself. As she explained to the counselor, the reason that she had her second abortion was, I quote, "I wanted to be able to hate myself more for what I did to the first baby. And if she committed abortion again, she would hate herself even more and feel more like she was paying an appropriate price." That is so dreadful. Do you see what was happening here? The first time she was punishing her husband. The second time she was punishing herself. Don't get me wrong. This wasn't repenting. Even so, something in her drove her to pay a price. Our situation in our culture is a lot like that of a corrupted automobile driver. He drives recklessly, he gets a ticket. Again, he drives recklessly, he gets another ticket. Yet again, he drives recklessly. He loses his license. He's not supposed to drive at all. He still drives. This time, if he's caught, his vehicle is going to be impounded. So, when he spots the patrolman, he turns the wrong way down a one-way street to get away. When the patrolman follows, he drives still faster down the one-way street. When the patrolman gets closer, he drives up on the sidewalk and is driving around crowds of people at light posts. When the patrolman continues to follow, he leans out the window with a gun and shoots at him. The warnings and punishments that would have deterred someone who was less stubborn drive him on to yet greater transgressions. You know, this is a commonplace in criminal punishment. Sometimes people say, if you punish this with capital punishment, then the guy's going to figure, well, I may as well shoot two of them. I'm, in for a penny, in for a pound. But it drives him on to yet greater transgressions, all in order to outrun the cop. He behaves worse, not because there isn't any patrolman, but because there is. We do much the same thing in the futile attempt to outrun our conscience. We behave worse, not because we don't have a conscience, but because we do, and we sense it back there on our trail. Eventually, we might lean out of the windows of our soul and shoot at it. And so we see that conscience works in three different modes. Most people are familiar with the first two modes. One is the cautionary mode. It alerts us to the peril of doing wrong and generates an inhibition against committing it. Don't do that. Don't do that. That's the cautionary mode. In the accusatory mode, conscience indicts us for wrong that we've already done. See what you did. See what you did. But for those who refuse to read the indictment, conscience kicks into the avenging mode, driving the wrongdoer's life further and further out of kilter. The revenge of conscience, I think, explains a sort of a paradoxical remark that was once made by the great G.K. Chesterton. He wrote, it was in one of his stories, actually, one of his characters says, "Men may keep a sort of level of good, but no man has ever been able to keep on one level of evil. That road goes down and down. Pursued by the five furies, we become worse than we were, and the process spins out of control." Now, in the long run, that's not necessarily bad. Otherwise, why would it be like that? Why would we have been made this way? As Dante found, for some of us, the road that leads up goes down for a long time first. I'm not being self-righteous, because although the history of my own self-deception and the details of it don't concern us here, that some of us once included me. Why must the road go down? Because for most of us at some times, and for some of us at most times, guilty knowledge is not exhortation enough. Drastic measures become necessary. Driving life out of kilter is, so to speak, the exhortation of last resort. We become worse than we were, but We'd intended to become worse than we were, because that's what obstinacy and denial are all about. And if we're that obstinate, there may come a point when the only hope for us is that we become even worse than we had planned and can't bear it anymore. If all goes well, we may finally be so wretched that, like the prodigal son, we come to ourselves, which really means coming to God, because we're made in His image. Apparently, for the chance to soften a heart, the unfathomable mercy of the Creator of the heart is even willing that for a while it may become more rock-like still. Thank you.
Well, what an honor it is to be here, to be asked to give this talk, and I can't really follow, I don't think, that opening act, but I'll do my best, and I'll really do my best not to fall and hurt myself here. But thanks again to Mariana, to the Thomistic Institute. So let's jump in. I'd like to begin with a text from Theognis of Megara, a 6th century Greek poet. He says, or rather cries, "Father Zeus, I would it were the gods' pleasure that wanton outrage should delight the wicked if so they choose, but that whosoever did acts abominable and of intent disdainfully, with no regard for the gods, should thereafter pay penalty himself. Would that this were the gods' pleasure, but alas, the doer escapes, and another bears the misfortune afterward. Yet how can it be rightful, O King of the immortals, that a man that has no part in unrighteous deeds, committing no transgression nor any perjury, but as a righteous man, should not fare well? Father Zeus, what frame of mind would a mortal have whenever an unjust and wicked man, who does not avoid the wrath of any god or man, commits a wanton outrage and rolls in wealth, while the just are worn out and consumed by harsh poverty?" End quote. It's a rather universal lament, heard everywhere from ancient Greece to the Psalms of the Hebrew Scriptures to contemporary Twitter feeds, or whatever they're called now. Much the same theme is also taken up in Plato's Gorgias, where Socrates argues that doing injustice is always worse than suffering it. Based on this principle, he concludes that even if a wicked man were to become powerful enough to kill him without suffering punishment from the city's laws, such an action would be worse for the killer than for Socrates because, quote, "it would be a villain killing an honest man." End quote. Callicles, apparently furious at the prospect of vicious actions going unpunished and virtue going unrewarded, gives the following response to Socrates' conclusion. And isn't that exactly what is deplorable? Callicles is indignant at the fact that, in many cases, vice and vicious actions seem to go unpunished. Too often a villain may injure or even kill an honest person and, at least seem to, get away with it. According to UT's own Devin Stauffer, we can see Callicles as a morally serious man, yet one who embraces extreme positions such as the goodness of outlandish hedonism and the justice of the strong opposing the weak, because he cannot bring himself to accept the risks inherent in living the virtuous life. On Stauffer's reading, Callicles can be understood as something of a disillusioned moral realist who is angered by the perceived lack of, let's call it, cosmic justice. The evil have all the fun and get away with it, and that is intolerable. Callicles therefore helps us recognize two connected and disquieting chasms in human life. First, there is often a fracture between the life of virtue and worldly success. And second, there is often a gap between vice and at least political punishment. The fury caused by the seeming lack of punishment for the wicked and the lack of security for the virtuous comes to dominate Callicles' soul, leading him to conclude that the best life is one in which a human agent makes himself strong enough to enlarge and to fulfill his appetites constantly and to harm others with impunity. The answer to the problem of the law's inability to punish all wrongdoing is to place yourself beyond the reach of the law, to move beyond good and evil. But perhaps we should ask if Callicles was correct, not in his conclusion, but in his premise that some vices go unpunished. More specifically, perhaps we should question the claim that vicious action, even if done properly and to the fullest extent in the tyrannical life, actually escapes punishment. Here's another text from ancient Greece, this time from Hesiod. Quote, "A man contrives evil for himself when he contrives evil for someone else, and an evil plan is most evil for the planner." End quote. And much later on, further to the north, in King Lear, Shakespeare has Edgar say the following words to his adopted brother after their duel. The gods are just, and of our pleasant vices make instruments to plague us. These brief yet insightful comments about the nature of vice, namely that the gods in their justice have arranged things so as to make vice itself a torment for the vicious, raise important questions relevant to our discussion today. Does vice, precisely in its function as a plague on its possessor, have something of the nature of a punishment? Even if vice is itself not a punishment for injustice, perhaps it's somehow intimately connected to something like a natural punishment for wrongdoing. If so, how does vice, as punishment, relate to the positive laws of apology? If Edgar is correct that vices plague those who exhibit and embody them, then how exactly do vices torment the morally vicious? Developing answers to these questions can help us formulate a response to Callicles' fear that vice seems to go unpunished. For help with these questions, let's turn first to Augustine. In the De Libro, Evodius, Augustine's interlocutor, introduces a distinction which Augustine enthusiastically accepts between two laws. On the one hand, there is the temporal law of a given political community, produced by human beings who can and often must adjust its particularities in order to align it properly with contingent realities within that community. On the other hand, there is the eternal law that endures unchanged through time and undergirds any instantiation of a just temporal law. Augustine says that no matter how good and effective a given temporal law may be, it leaves many morally depraved individual actions, as well as the citizens' disordered loves, unpunished. Thus, Augustine identifies the same problem that perhaps troubled Callicles, who, as we have seen, also recognized the limitations of what Augustine calls the temporal law. Augustine, however, does not despair of finding some form of retribution for wrongdoing that escapes the jurisdiction of the temporal law. He says that even if disordered passions, actions, and vices do escape the correction of the temporal law, they are not left completely outside the realm of legal rectification. Vices and individual morally repugnant actions may escape punishment by the city, but they are justly punished according to the eternal law. Here's Evodius. It seems to me that a law drafted to govern society rightly permits these things, and also that divine providence rightly redresses them. The temporal law has its scope redressing deeds sufficiently to maintain peace among unenlightened people, to the extent that such deeds can be governed by human beings. The other faults, however, have different penalties, appropriate to them, from which wisdom alone, it seems to me, can free them. So, what are these other penalties imposed by divine providence and the eternal law upon actions or vices or disordered loves that seem to escape the punishment of temporal law? In order to discover these other penalties, do we have to resort to a Socratic myth of the afterlife, or to a revealed doctrine of original sin and God's final judgment in the afterlife? Are those our only two options, namely despair at the fact that the unjust go unpunished, or some kind of either revealed truth or even a myth of the afterlife, such that justice will be done once we die? Are these the only two options? And I'm going to argue no, they're not the only two options. I'll anticipate my answer now and then develop it as we go along. I'm going to argue, kind of in a line here with Shakespeare, that vice itself is somehow the penalty imposed by the eternal law for vicious actions. That is, simply being a vicious person is itself the punishment demanded by eternal justice. As virtue is in many ways its own reward, so vice is its own punishment. This approach to virtue and vice is in stark contrast to utilitarian theories of morality. Ours is a more metaphysical approach. Being a person with an intelligently formed character is good and rewarding, even though it requires discipline and may be physically unpleasant at times. But being conflicted or virtuous entails its own misery, regardless of the pleasures or external goods one may or may not possess. However, vice is a habit, a habitus, a hexis. It's the result of the agent's prior decisions, and it's the source of a conflict in the life of that vicious person. The vicious agent may be consistent in his actions and emotions and thus may not struggle with the conflicts that characterize Aristotle's continent and incontinent agents, but the vicious agent is conflicted in another way. He is conflicted because he is separated from and at odds with his natural end. And while the vice itself is voluntary insofar as the actions that result in the vice are chosen, the vicious agent does not choose this conflict itself. The unhappiness and dissolution that comes from vice is the result of the agent's separation from his natural end. And therefore, we can say that he chooses the vice in some sense, or he chooses the actions that get him into the vice, but not the unhappiness and disorder that results from the vice. We can develop these points by turning to some of Aquinas' reflections on natural law. In a clear development of really both Aristotle and Augustine, Aquinas says that, quote, every law aims at establishing friendship, either between men themselves or between man and God. The end, or the finis, of all law is friendship and the social concord characteristic of friends. Thomas also says that law is ordered towards the common happiness of the community it directs, and that it is formulated so as to render its subjects virtuous. Following Aristotle, Aquinas presents law, virtue, and friendship as inseparable aspects of human happiness within social and political life. The perfection of the law is to make the citizens flourish in virtue, thus enabling them to enter into friendships that constitute the common good of the political body. He gets this directly from Aristotle, who gets it from Plato. When we turn to Aquinas' treatment of the natural law, we see the influence of Augustine even more clearly. Augustine defines the natural law as, quote, nothing other than the rational creature's participation in the eternal law, with eternal law understood as God's divine wisdom moving all creatures to their proper acts and ends. The natural law is the manner in which God directs human agents to realize freely their natural end of virtuous friendships amongst themselves and between themselves and God. The natural law governs human agents and enables them to be provident for themselves and for others by directing them towards happiness through the inculcation of virtue and the formation of friendships. Thus, the natural inclinations articulated by St. Thomas, the inclinations to the conservation of one's being according to one's nature, to marriage and family, to the knowledge of God and social life, are completed and perfected by virtue leading to familial, political, and intellectual friendships. Aquinas, like Augustine, recognizes that human law cannot and should not attempt to punish all bad actions, but that it must punish the most serious offenses. And Aquinas adds that, quote, there are many things directed by God's law that cannot be directed by human law, since there are more things subject to a higher cause than to a lower cause. Hence, the very fact that human law does not intrude into matters that it cannot direct flows from the order of the eternal law, end quote. It is not only that eternal law, and thus the natural law is our participation in that eternal law, redresses those evil passions and actions left unregulated by human law. Rather, or further, it is part of the natural law itself that human law must leave unregulated certain immoral passions and actions, which will be redressed by a higher natural law. It's also important to keep in mind that punishment does not enter into Aquinas' definition of law. I think this is a very important point. Law is an ordinance of reason for the common good made by the person or group in charge of the community and promulgated. Punishment is not of the essence itself of law. However, punishment is a per se property of law. Law is functioning as a rule and measure for human actions with coercive force, as well as the punishments necessary for this role, flow from the essence of law. For law to function as law, there must be punishments for the violations of its statutes. Further, Aquinas argues that punishment must be against the will of the one punished. Quote, punishment may be considered in two ways. In one way, according to the very notion of punishment, and in this way, punishment is due only to sin, because through punishment the equality of justice is restored, inasmuch as he who, by sinning, has followed his own will too much, undergoes something against his will. In another way, punishment can be considered insofar as it is a medicine, not only healing past sin, but also preserving from future sin or promoting some good. Punishment must be some pain or the privation of some good that goes against the will of the one punished, but aims at reforming his or her character. Since we're asking about punishments for violating the natural law as distinct from the positive law, we have to distinguish two kinds of punishments. The first we can call conventional punishments, and the second, natural punishments. Conventional punishments correspond to positive law and are imposed artificially. They are instituted by a human authority who has charge of a political community, and this authority establishes a connection between this crime and this punishment. One country may punish drivers who violate the speed limit with monetary fines, while another country may punish the same crime with mandatory community service. And each of these penalties would or could be just, assuming everything else is also in place. The key is that there is no intrinsic, natural connection between this particular crime and this particular punishment. But the penalty is binding once it is established through the proper political channels. By contrast, the natural law exhibits natural punishments in which there is an intrinsic connection between the wrongdoing and the punishment, or at least that's the claim. Natural punishments are not imposed artificially by a given political body, but result from the very nature of the actions being undertaken. To claim that there are natural punishments for violations of some natural moral norm is to claim that there is a retributive mechanism embedded in the very nature of things. These punishments do not change from country to country or through the course of history, although our knowledge of them can and does increase or decrease across cultures and throughout history. While we must study or be taught conventional punishments, that's what a law school is for in part, natural punishments manifest themselves naturally. They are based metaphysically on human nature and are known, or at least discoverable, naturally by the light of human reason. Finally, they must, as we've seen, extend to areas of human life and conduct outside the jurisdiction of the positive law. So now let's refine our earlier question. How does the natural law provide natural punishments for vices left untouched by the human law? Aquinas claims that there is a natural punishment for vicious actions, a punishment that is ontologically prior to conventional punishments, and that exhibits a wider reach than penalties established by positive law. He says that the remorse of conscience is the natural penalty for evil actions. The pain of conscience that rebukes us for our evil actions is a natural punishment. It goes against our will, it causes pain, it restores the equality of justice that we had violated in overindulging our own desires, and if heeded, the remorse of conscience can be the first step in a moral conversion. That is, it has a medicinal function as well as a punitive one, or rather, it's medicinal insofar as it is punitive. Thus, the natural punishment, according to Aquinas, for violating the natural law is the pain or remorse of conscience that is suffered by human agents after committing morally corrupt actions. And if you want three fantastic literary examples of this, you have to read The Betrothed. The unnamed man who's the kind of embodiment of evil has an incredible remorse of conscience one evening. Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment is basically an entire novel about the pain and remorse of conscience. And Julia Flight in Brideshead Revisited has one of the most magnificent scenes of the awakening of her conscience. Now, earlier I suggested that vice itself is a punishment for evil actions insofar as vice corrupts human nature and separates its possessor from the natural end of happiness. We now have another dimension to the punishment for evil actions that escape the rectification of the positive law. The remorse of conscience is a natural punishment imposed on human agents for bad actions, even if they escape the jurisdiction of a positive law. However, this raises an important question. How reliable is this penalty for violating the natural law? Will the remorse of conscience apply to each and every instance of moral wrongdoing, or will we have to search for an infallible punishment that will be applicable even when someone's conscience fails? If we are honest with ourselves, we all know that our conscience is fallible. We have to form our conscience according to the natural and the revealed law. And our conscience can be mistaken. It can be badly formed, or it can be deadened by habitual sin, that is, by vice. Aquinas has this line, as you know very well, where he says, those tricky Germans for a long time thought that theft was okay, right? They thought there was no problem with this. He gives other examples. While we must avoid anachronistically attributing a doctrine of conscience to Aristotle, he does recognize something akin to this phenomenon. He says that one of the factors distinguishing the vicious from the incontinent agent is precisely the fact that the vicious man has no remorse for his bad actions. His character is such that his already completed intemperance or unjust actions do not spur him to repent, and therefore, on Aristotle's account, he's incurable. Aristotle says that the vicious human being, as distinct from the one who merely lacks self-control, the vicious human being, he says, does not take notice of his vice. His moral wickedness escapes his attention. If we claim that remorse of conscience is the sole and only punishment proper to the natural law, then I think we encounter a serious difficulty here. Since the conscience of an evil person will be malformed to the greatest extent, the judgments of his conscience will be mistaken most often. And therefore, the person in greatest need of punishment from the natural law will be the one who seems to escape such punishment, You mentioned the Nazi doctors. I've read reports of Nazi SS soldiers, and they seem to express no remorse, the ones that I've read. Charles Manson would be another famous example.
They
here.
express none.
They express none. Even if he does not completely escape the remorse of conscience, the pain he feels from committing bad actions will decrease as the vicious person falls deeper into vice, or one could argue. Therefore, it seems that the actions that deserve punishment, if repeated often enough, might actually blunt the sting of the punishment. If that's true, then we have not fully answered Callicles' worry about evil going unpunished. Because the conscience of a human agent can be corrupted, I would suggest we have to look for another punishment for violating the natural law that will complement, not replace, but complement the remorse of conscience. So where do we go? Let's turn back for a moment to the connection between law, virtue, and friendship. Virtue is among the finest things in part because it renders us fit for true friendships. Virtue harmonizes our own intellectual, practical, and effective lives in concord with those around us through the pursuit of common ends through common actions. Vice, however, sets up strife within our own practical decision-making and renders us incapable of harmonious interactions with others. Disordered appetites, evil actions, and vices make us incapable of friendship. And I wish to claim that the incapacity for friendship and the resultant misery of being friendless are punishments the natural law provides for vices that remain unchecked by the human law. Disordered appetites, evil actions, and vices put human agents at odds with their natural end of happiness precisely by making them incapable of friendship. Thus, I'm suggesting that 1, the inability to be a friend and the pain inherent in a life without friendship are punishments proper to the natural law, and that these complement the remorse of conscience. Aristotle's reflections on friendship shed some light on this. He distinguishes between self-love and selfishness, and he claims that proper self-love is the foundation for the love of friendship with others. For a friend is another self. To love a friend is to work for the good of that friend, for the friend's sake, and the friend's good, for the friend's sake, becomes my own good. That is, it becomes our good, because we relate to one another as each relates to himself. This love of friendship for another is rooted in a healthy love of self, according to Aristotle. The person who loves himself properly desires truth, virtuous actions, and that which is beautiful, to kalon, above all else. And this sort of man, Aristotle says, more than the selfish sort, seems to be a self-lover. He awards himself what is finest and best of all, and gratifies the most controlling part of himself, that is, his mind, nous, obeying his mind and truth in everything, end quote. Such a person, according to Aristotle, is most of all a self-lover, and his intelligently formed desires coalesce with the common good, bringing him into harmony with others. For, quote, when everyone strives to achieve what is noble and fine and concentrates on the finest actions, everything that is right will be done for the common good, and each person individually will receive the greatest of goods, since that is the character of virtue. And so the good person must be a self-lover, since he will both help himself and benefit others by doing fine actions, end quote. By contrast, the selfish person competes with others for the goods of money, pleasure, and notoriety. Selfish people love themselves poorly by constantly gratifying, quote, their appetites, and in general their feelings and the non-rational part of the soul, end quote. Such people cannot exhibit the features of friendship with themselves that we have highlighted because, quote, they are at odds with themselves and have an appetite for one thing and a wish or desire for another, end quote. The soul of the base person is torn by faction, and each part of the soul frantically pulls in the wrong direction as though they were tearing him apart. And one of the most perceptive comments, I think, in the history of moral reflection, Aristotle says that selfish people seek the company of others in an attempt to flee from themselves. You were getting at this, I think, very well. A selfish person, due to his base character, cannot enjoy his own company. So he seeks to be around others, usually those with similar moral faults, in order to distract himself from the knowledge of what and who he is, from the memories of his base deeds, and from the anticipation of future odious actions. He seeks to pass his days with others so as to forget who he is and what he has done. As distinct from communion and friendship with others, the mere company of others, in this sense, is the instrumental use of other people in order to distract the user from acknowledging his faults and his character. Mere company involves self-concealment from oneself and from others, motivated by the Sisyphean desire to flee from ourselves. The inability to be a friend to oneself or to another, coupled with and stemming from the inner dissolution caused by base passions and unintelligent actions, is a natural punishment for violating the natural law. Hiding from yourself in the company of others while being incapable of true communion or friendship is a bipartite punishment for violating the natural law. And in this penalty, we can see the dual dimensions of human nature. Perfection of oneself through proper social and political relationships with others, they're both frustrated here. The natural telos of virtue and friendship remains for the indecent person. He's still human. But this telos is thwarted and his nature corrupted. He seeks the company of others in order to escape the thought of his own vice while being incapable of true communion. We should also note that these dual dimensions are, of course, necessarily intertwined. Just as proper self-love is the basis of a friendship love of another, so improper self-love or selfishness renders one incapable of being a friend to oneself or to another. So now, I think, we can see, 1, the remorse of conscience, 2, the inner dissolution caused by disordered appetites, and 3, the inability to be a friend to others, work in concert as punishments proper to the natural law. Different kinds of human agents are apt to suffer more from one kind of natural punishment than from another. And even a single human person may be afflicted in varying ways as his character develops or degenerates throughout his life. The worse a human agent becomes, the more the inability to be a friend to others comes to the fore as the punishment imposed by the natural law, while the remorse of conscience recedes. The better a human agent becomes, and thus the closer to virtue and friendship, the more the remorse of conscience will be prominent and effective as a punishment for unruly passions or base actions, while the punishment of being unable to be a friend to others recedes. The remorse of conscience and the inability to be a friend to oneself or to another therefore work in harmony to constitute a natural retributive mechanism for moral wrongdoing. This trinity of natural punishments is deeper than any positive law because they're rooted in what we are as human persons, not just as citizens. Together, they cover all disordered appetites and vices, not just the worst. They are against the will of the offender, and they are publicly and naturally manifest. For all know immediately that the conscience can sting, that bad men do not have friends, and that even thieves must have justice amongst themselves, and we all know that nobody really wants a miserable, lonely life. For Aquinas, friendship is the end or perfection of the natural law, and therefore violations of the natural law render us incapable of achieving and enjoying that end. That is our natural punishment. To return to the quotes with which we began, perhaps we can end by saying that God is just insofar as he constitutes the natural order of things in such a way that vice plagues its possessor by rendering him unable to be a true friend to himself or to others. And maybe we can respond to the issues raised by Callicles. The Calliclean way of life demands that, quote, the best man let his appetites grow as large as possible and not restrain them. And when these are as large as possible, he must have the power to serve them and to fill them with whatever he has an appetite for at any time, end quote. Callicles may have championed this life, at least in part, due to his failure to find a source of eternal, let's say, cosmic justice. But we have shown that the tyrannical hedonistic life recommended by Callicles is itself a manifestation of the punishment he feared did not exist. Angered by the seeming lack of punishment for crime and vice, Callicles and those inspired by him choose a life that is itself the punishment for their vices. Callicles, like all tyrants, is at odds with himself and incapable of communion or friendship, and thus he involuntarily manifests what he feared did not obtain in the cosmos. Thank you.
Now invite both professors to join me up here. Wow, what an absolute treat. This was fantastic, and I thoroughly enjoyed hearing from both of you. We're going to open up this time of question and answer just by letting you both ask questions to another, whether that's prodding on something, mentioning a place of disagreement.
Just one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to go first?
Sure.
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, I'm going to cheat a little bit and ask too. First of all, fantastic paper. Thank you. Really, really well written. Really, really good stuff. 2 questions. You distinguish between guilty knowledge and guilty feelings, which I think is a very, very important distinction. So I thought it was great that was brought up. And unless I'm mistaken, you seem to say that guilt, or maybe suggest that guilty knowledge is enough for punishment. If I'm right on that, I wonder if that's true, that punishment can be just a form of knowledge. It seems to me punishment has to be more than just knowledge. So I may be incorrect about the claim.
Okay. Shall I answer that one before your second one?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that I'm not. In one sense, of course, one could say that guilty knowledge, the awareness of having done wrong, is a punishment. Because it's against the natural order of knowledge. This isn't what, we see that it's true, but in a way we don't assent to our knowledge. There's something disordered in us. However, the emphasis that I wanted to make was a little bit different, that the guilty knowledge will have other bad consequences that we experience badly, irrespective of the state of our feelings, over and above the mere fact of the knowledge.
Okay. And the second question maybe gets a little closer to, if there's any disagreement here, to maybe what it is. Of course, Aristotle's 4 character types, the virtuous, and even freshmen get this in ethics classes, right? So you've got but it's perennial, it's fantastic. So you've got the virtuous, you've got the one with self-control, the one lacking self-control, and the vicious. And really there are 6, because he says there's the godlike and then the brutish. And I guess my question is, your description is very beautiful. It's powerful, especially even some of the examples of the way that people experienced different sort of problems with their conscience. But does it really fit only the acratic person? In other words, are those descriptions really only applicable to the one who merely lacks self-control and not to the vicious or the brutish person?
No, I think that they're applicable to all people. Even the brutish. A question that I often get from my students is, what about sociopaths? What about horrible people who never feel any remorse, et cetera, et cetera? I think there's something really problematic even here. The sociopath is maybe a person who doesn't have normal moral feelings. He doesn't feel a sense of duty, a sense of obligation, a sense of gratitude, a sense of remorse. But he does have guilty knowledge. We would say that the problem here is not just lack of self-control. There's something else much more deeply wrong. And I think that even in such cases as this, what I was calling the theories, these pathologies of conscience are operating there too. There was a very interesting case of this. I guess you would not call this a person who simply lacked self-control. There was a fellow who was written up in a news report. I wish I'd kept the article years ago, here in the city of Austin. He had gone into a video rental store. The videos were these things, folks, that people used to be able to, and they used to rent them. Well, anyway, he I don't know why, he blew away the clerk. He just shot him. And the police released public statements saying that he was a man without a conscience. This interested the newspaper, and they sent a reporter down to talk with him. And so the reporter said, "Don't you feel bad for what you did?" And he said, "No." Well, somebody must have smelled a rat, because on a later occasion, another reporter went and talked to the same guy. And he asked the same question. But I think this must have been the sort of person who wasn't afraid of a silence. He said, "Don't you feel bad for what you did?" And the guy said, "No." Pause. There must be something wrong with me, don't you think? Because I should feel bad about what I did. This is not just a problem of lack of self-control. There are deeper pathologies going on here. We don't use Aristotle's classification, but we speak of sociopaths, for instance.
Sure.
And I think that the same thing, these kinds of things are inescapable. Okay? All right. Now I've got one for you. One of the things that I enjoyed is that our talks complemented each other, I thought. I didn't claim that the disorders, that the furies were the only aspect of the natural penalties of the natural law. And you commented on many of those that I agree with completely, that were over and above those. But I'm wondering, this has always been a matter of great interest to me. How would you approach somebody who says, he could speak to either one of us? He could say, "Well, I'm not suffering the furies of conscience, Budziszewski." He could say to you, "I don't find that I'm not in friendship with myself, or that my friendships with others have been impaired. And I don't experience this as the punishment." How would you begin to approach a person like this? How would you speak to him?
Oh boy, that's a very practical question, and I am not a counselor, so I want to just say I want to punt and say I'll pray for you or something, but, which I would do. I think you have to sort of maybe just start by asking a series of questions. And I think that have to be very descriptive, very empirical. And just describe the nature of the bond you have with the people around you. You call so-and-so your friend. Well, describe what you do together. How does he or she respond to you? Upon what is your relationship based? This came up it comes up all the time for me when I teach Catholic social teaching, and I get this from Russ Hittinger and I, we always go on and on about this, is you ask the 4 questions, which is who belongs to whom? What's the nature of the bond? For what ends is that bond constituted? And then what do the people owe to each other in virtue of the answers to the first 3 questions? So I would go through a series of those questions with such a person and say, just without beating around the bush, without embellishing, no euphemism, who do you belong to in the social sense? What's the nature of that bond? For what do you have that bond? What are you trying to do together? What are you trying to accomplish together? And then what do you think you owe each other? And I think, if you get honest answers to those questions, it should be pretty obvious if the person has real friendships or not, The unnamed person in the betrothed understands immediately that everyone fears him, but no one loves him. He's happy to say it, right? So that's how I would go about it. The other thing, too, is one more thing maybe, just to draw on Brideshead Revisited, Julia's conscience is awakened because her brother tells her very succinctly and very clearly, with charity, too, not in an aggressive way, you're living in sin. And she says that one word, sin. So I would say you have to call things by their right name.
Yeah.
Stop hiding behind euphemisms.
I wasn't going to ask another question, but I am going to, as just a follow-up, because it's fascinating to me. I agree with you. Friendship is so important. It's so fundamental to the texture of human life. It is such a ghastly tragedy when we lose it, and yet it isn't talked about. Aristotle's he talks about friendship in the context of his politics. He talks about it in the context of his ethics. He follows up his chapter on justice with a chapter on friendship.
It's 1/5 of the ethics.
1/5 of the ethics. I can't imagine a political science or a civics textbook today giving any time at all to friendship.
Yeah.
And we don't, or I think of Thomas Aquinas in his treatise on kingship.
Yeah.
He spends quite a bit of time talking about how the tyrant is going to lose the possibility of friendship. He won't have any friends. And that was a sort of a standard argument among the ancients. Why do you think we don't talk about that anymore in contemporary social thought? Catholic social thought, yes. But why don't we talk about that in contemporary social thought? What has happened? I guess I'm asking for a diagnosis.
Well, this is, like a year-long course we'd have to teach together to try to diagnose this properly. But you had I'm going to draw on Strauss a little bit here. These waves of modernity, what did they have in common? They all hated friendship, or at least ignored it, right? Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, go on and on and on. They're not seeing, none of them saw friendship as the bond itself that brought a society together. Or if they did, it was just kind of hand-waving here and there. Every now and then a friend, a comment would come up. Thomas Priver was this fantastic professor at Catholic U, said one time that for Hobbes, friendship is terrible. And I think he was quoting Frank Slade, who's another very good political philosopher. And so I think we're the offspring, whether we like it or not, in some sense, we're the offspring. At least our culture is, in many ways, many respects, the offspring of kind of a very long and pretty successful, unfortunately, assault on the nature and importance of friendship for social and political life. And of course, you add into that the technological revolution and all the things that have come up, and all of that has done. And by the way, Marshall McLuhan is probably prophetic here, right? The medium is the message, all these great insights he had. But the way we communicate now tends to actually take us away from the incarnate interactions that are the very basis of human life, but are, of course, the basis of any kind of friendship. It's the lifeblood of friendship, are these incarnate face-to-face actions where we eat together and laugh and say things, right? But the technology has taken us more and more away. So it's coming from all different quarters. And of course, even if you go back before that, religion as a kind of a social or cultural glue as well. The lack of religious practice now, of course, across all kind of denominations would also play a role here. Putnam's thing, bowling alone it would be interesting on this, just to kind of trace how much of this has been lost as an empirical way of tracing. Anyway,
Okay. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This is fantastic. Just even sitting up here is a great privilege for me. And if the two of you ever do decide to teach that class of friendship together, I will be the first to sign up.
That'd be fun. Yeah.
I have a bit of a follow-up question,
Sure.
really about what you were just speaking of. So, to what extent is technology and the virtual world that we're living in, through social media and mass media, enabling our forgetfulness of the conscience and kind of removing us from the possibility of true friendship? And to follow up with that, and what do we do about it?
Maybe I can start with the second part of it. So the question was about the way in which we communicate. What does that do to friendship, right? I mean, I kind of go back to those first few books of Genesis here, and because I teach this somewhat regularly in a class called The God of Faith and Reason. So I try to go through some of this. And I go to the issue of nakedness in original justice before original sin. And what does it signify? Well, it signifies that I am unconcealed and you are unconcealed, which I think is an image of truth, aletheia, uncovering. So nakedness there signifies first, I know the truth of myself and I know the truth about you, and you know the truth about me, and you know the truth, and there's nothing impeding our knowledge of who and what we are and the basis of our relationship. So there's self-disclosure. Second thing I think is important about the issue of nakedness is that there's nothing impeding the act of love, right? Nothing is in the way of expressing the act of love. So I have perfect knowledge of the other, or as good as it could be. Nothing is impeding the knowledge of myself or the other. I'm unconcealed in that sense. And I'm unimpeded in my true love of the other, and the other is unimpeded in his or her true love of me. Okay, well, I think that's a part of the essence of friendship. And to be friends, you have to show yourself to the other, and the other has to show himself or herself to you. It has to be based on truth. And we have to be moving towards the same thing, the same goal together, but we have to know who we are as we do that. There's no hiding in real friendship, right? Maybe in utilitarian friendships, certainly in friendships based only on pleasure. But if it's real friendship, I know you and you know me as we go together towards the same goal, which means it's based upon knowledge and love of the other. Well, what happens when you introduce all of the different absences that come in through technology? You hide. I mean, the very medium hides you from the other. You're not as disclosed as you would be in any kind of face-to-face interaction. It bleaches out the emotional component. It bleaches out all of the nonverbal ways of communication. In other words, and even if it's against your will, even if it's not what you're trying to do, you're hidden from the other, and the other is hidden from you in a very, very, very real and deep sense. Even if you're on Zoom, you're still hidden in that sense from the other. So there's not the same kind of self-disclosure. There can't be. And you can't, I mean, in what way are you really working towards, how does the love work in that? Are you really working towards something? I mean, I often think, well, an email is good for planning a meeting, but it's not, you can't meet an email. I mean, you can try, but it's not the proper medium for that. So to express the love, you got to be with each other. And so I think those two essential aspects of friendship are just bleached out or filtered out by a lot of the distance and absences that come from our forms of communication now.
I think that's absolutely right. Thank you. We have time for a few questions from the audience. So, Henry.
Is the lack of rumination in our generation. So that's rumination over yourself or even moral laws itself, morality itself. And I think that you had a beautiful discussion about the natural consequences of going against natural law. And it seems that it's to recognize that in yourself, you have to undergo rumination. You have to really think about this.
Yeah.
Okay, the reasons that these things are happening to me is because I've succumbed to my vices and I've become a vicious person. And I'm just wondering, how do you think the knowledge of the consequences affects the consequences itself? Are you more punished for not knowing, or are you more punished for knowing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is that for me or for your professor? Or
I think either of you can start off.
Yeah, I think that one of the reasons that we don't ruminate is that we're terrified to do so. You alluded to this. You said, is it worse to be aware of this or worse not to be aware of it? Look, I'm not against music. I think music is great. I love music. But one of the functions of modern music is to have a constant noise going so that you're never alone with your thoughts. That's not good. Somebody once said that he imagined that in heaven everything would either be music or silence. I don't know if that is true, but we have plenty of what passes for music, and we have almost no silence. You notice also. Now, a lot of the kind of music that I listen to some avant-garde jazz and things like this, and they've got a strong beat, fine. But also one of the functions of a certain kind of beat is also that it doesn't arouse our minds, it arouses our bodies. They respond to this. They go pump, 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 pump. Which is another thing that distracts us from the silence in the mind. We don't want to go into that place. And we can't, you talked about disclosing ourselves to each other. Now, there are several reasons we don't disclose ourselves to each other. One is, of course, that we're aware of dark places, dark things that we don't want to disclose even if we're aware of them. But another is that we don't know what's in there. We have no idea. And sometimes when we come to the edges of it, even the good things. One writer spoke of that throne inside each of us where only one can sit. But if the wrong thing is sitting on that throne, you don't want to even become aware of that. This is chilling. It is terrifying. Or it's not just a matter of not ruminating. It's not just a matter of music, sound, social media that distract us. It's also busyness. We even now treat it as a plus in your college applications. If you've got so many activities and so many clubs that you belong to in high school and so forth, that where did you ever have time to just be sitting around in the sun and thinking, what does it all mean? What do I think about that? We can't do this any longer. I know somebody who has, if there's any spot in her life for quiet, she fills it up with another activity. And then piles another one on top of that so that it's hectic and painful, but she chooses this over and over. These are real grave problems.
Maybe just to add, just to piggyback on that, a friend of mine has pointed out, he loves, let's say, older music. And he said, to pick up with the music theme, it's very rare nowadays that anyone harmonizes together. Very rare. Maybe there's some good examples that I'm not aware of. And I think it's an interesting kind of cultural marker in this sense that I would say the thinking and the rumination and sort of all of those activities that would give you some sense of the truths that we're trying to grapple with here, I would say the vast majority of it is not going to be solipsistic. The vast majority of it is going to come within friendships, starting in the family, right? So I often tell some of my students that I'm a little bit closer with, you come to know yourself in encountering someone else, right? And first and foremost, you come to know yourself when you encounter God, right? But the knowledge and then the reflection that you have after that, the more personal, monastic kind of reflection, I think is always sort of reflecting on what you've seen in light of those encounters with the other, right? So I think, to go back to my first answer, because that has fallen away so much, because there is less friendship, there is less, just in general, sociality, right? There's also less self-knowledge, and there's less reflection on these things. And that to me has to start in the family. And then you reflect on your own, in the silence of your own heart and the silence of your own mind. Yeah, you have to have both components, seems to me.
Yeah, you need them both. You need your friends, but you also need silence. And even friends, there can be such a thing as too much of a good thing or too much of a falsified good thing. You can use your activities with your friends to block out any self-knowledge too if you don't do this right. But we've lost the arts of friendship, and so we don't know this.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. So, Beckett, you got it.
This is mostly a question for our guests. I think I see a tension in your very interesting and thought-provoking account. And maybe you can set me straight. But Aristotle says that virtue is extremely important for the highest form of friendship, which I notice is the kind that you focus on, right here. But Aristotle's virtues don't include the theological virtues.
Sure.
And so I wondered if you think that friendship can perhaps always be a punishment for vice, or if it can also be a natural distraction from our supernatural end or the attainment of full virtue.
my part was it's the inability to be a friend that's the natural punishment. Friendship is not the natural punishment.
Yes.
That's what at least that's what I thought I heard you say.
Maybe punishment is too strong, but it can take you away from development of full virtue if it leads you towards the natural virtue, but not towards the theological.
Oh, I see. So are you saying, can friendship itself on a natural level be something like a punishment for violating the natural law because it distracts us from the theological virtues? Is that the question?
Yes.
Well, I mean, you may know, I mean, when Aquinas, and it's also kind of Augustine, and it's right in the New Testament from the Gospel of John. I mean, when Jesus calls us to love him, he calls us his friends, right? And so it's not, charity, as Aquinas says, is nothing other than the friendship of God and man, right? Which is a gift from God in this case, right? So that's not a rejection, or that's not something other than friendship. That's a supernatural friendship now. And I would say if the natural friendship is really a friendship, then it's not going to lead you away from the highest kinds of things, right? I mean, for Aristotle, he's just a good pagan. I mean, we shouldn't expect too much of him. Right? He's just a good pagan. That's it. That's all he is. No more, no less. But even him, he thinks that real friendship culminates in intellectual friendship.
Yes.
And intellectual friendship for him really culminates in knowledge of the one true God known simply through philosophical thinking, right? So even there, you have something like a natural opening to, now it's by nature, it's not by grace, but it's a natural opening, you might say, right? To something that's going to be taken up into the theological life, into the supernatural life. And Aquinas has this great line, and I quote it all the time. He says, grace imitates nature, right? So we often hear it quoted that grace heals nature, that it elevates nature, that it perfects nature. That's all true and fundamental. But he also says that grace imitates nature because the creator of nature is also the one who gives grace, right? And so I would say that in this question, that might shed some light on it, because I think supernaturally, through the life of grace and friendship with God, you have something which is imitating, you might say, the natural structure of friendship that you can achieve, in some sense at least, even apart from grace.
I'd like to add one thing to that, and perhaps you'll agree. In the highest friendships, in my own case, I think of my friendship with my wife, my marital friendship. Now, this is an erotic friendship. But there's a longing, of course. There are different kinds of longings in friendship. One desires the knowledge of the other. One desires physical union with the other in marriage. There are these natural longings. But the interesting thing is that these longings themselves kindle another longing. All those things can be satisfied by things in the natural order. You want physical union with the beloved, there is such a thing. You want mutual self-disclosure and knowledge of the other, there is such a thing. You want to have a meal together, there is such a thing as food. But these longings these natural longings for things that can be satisfied in the natural order, kindle a natural longing that cannot be satisfied in the natural order, that really directs us to God. And people sometimes experience that second longing, and the beloved doesn't satisfy that because she's not God. And so they think my marriage is a failure, what's wrong, and think I need to fall in love with again, I'll have an affair. And no, that's not it. What the two need to do is walk together into God.
If I could even add one more point to that too, because that's such an important point to bring up. We even catch Augustine very famously has the great line, right? Our hearts are made for you and they're restless until the rest of me. But even on the, let's say, the purely natural pagan level, it's Plato's Symposium.
Oh, yeah.
Because even there's something higher even than philosophy for him. And that something higher, he even says it's something like a friendship with God, insofar as such a thing might be possible. So even there, it's from both the pagan and the Judeo-Christian perspective, you have this infinite longing, which will be satisfied, this infinite eros of the soul, which is going to be satisfied by nothing less than union with God himself, right?
I think that's an excellent note for us to end on. So please join me. Well, thank you all for coming out here. Very glad to see so many faces. If you're interested in what the Thomistic Institute or the Austin Institute does, come up and speak to us. We'll be around after lunch.